Good morning. I'm Dan DeRose with 19 News, coming to you from our digital desk. We're going to be taking you live to East Palestine. Of course, that is the site of that tragic train derailment, the toxic train derailment of last year. The NTSB board, and there is the chair of the National Transportation Safety Bureau. They are going to be holding their meeting in East Palestine. This is to vote on the final findings, probable cause, and recommendations coming out of that tragedy in East Palestine. So let's take you there live.
NTSB's accident and incident investigations are conducted to determine the facts, conditions, and circumstances relating to an accident or incident and the probable cause thereof. This information is then used to ascertain measures that would best prevent similar accidents or incidents in the future. Accident and incident investigations are fact-finding proceedings and are not conducted for the purpose of determining the rights or the liabilities of any party. Today's meeting is open to the public in accordance with the Government in the Sunshine Act. We're here to discuss the final investigation report of the February 3rd, 2023 derailment and subsequent hazardous materials release involving Norfolk Southern Railway General Merchandise Freight Train 32N here in East Palestine, Ohio. The derailment occurred shortly after a hot bearing detector broadcast a critical alarm about a wheel bearing's temperature. 38 rail cars derailed, 11 of which were transporting hazardous material. 3 of these hazardous materials tank cars sustained mechanical breaches during the derailment and released flammable or combustible materials. 5 others released flammable gases as a result of fire exposure and deliberate breaching with explosives to perform a vent and burn procedure. On behalf of the entire agency, I want to recognize the significant impact that this derailment has had on the community in East Palestine, Ohio, in Darlington, Pennsylvania, and all the surrounding areas throughout the state of Ohio, throughout the state of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, some have sought to minimize the wide-ranging impacts of this derailment, pointing to the fact that there were no fatalities or injuries. For this, we are certainly grateful, but the absence of a fatality or injury doesn't mean the presence of safety. The absence of a fatality or injury doesn't mean the presence of safety. The NTSB exists to ensure the presence of safety, to shine light on the vulnerabilities that compromise safety. We don't wait for a death or injury to occur. We bring safety issues to the forefront and make recommendations that, if implemented, would prevent the next train derailment or fire. To the community at large, on behalf of the NTSB, I'm so sorry that this happened. We are so sorry that this happened here. Our hearts are with you. Today may be difficult for many of you. So volunteer mental health clinicians from the American Red Cross and Salvation Army are available throughout today's proceedings. Please see staff at the back. We have Elias Contanis and we have Stephanie Matonic from our Transportation Disaster Assistance Division in the back, wearing NTSB logo gear. They will connect you with the appropriate representatives, and thank you to the Salvation Army and the American Red Cross for their support. I also want to thank Chris Neifer, Superintendent of East Palestine City Schools, and the entire staff of East Palestine High School for hosting us once again for this final board meeting and for all their work and kind words and actions welcoming us to East Palestine during the investigative hearing last June. I want to thank the East Palestine Police Department, East Palestine Fire and EMS, the Columbiana County Sheriff's Office, Ohio State Highway Patrol, in particular the Lisbon Post, and Federal Protective Services Region 5, Chicago, for working with us closely since day one of this investigation through our hearing in June and now this board meeting. I also want to thank the numerous police officers, firefighters, dispatchers, hazmat teams, EMTs, and others who responded to this derailment. 48 entities were involved in the response, including the East Palestine Police Department, the East Palestine Fire Department, and fire departments from neighboring communities and throughout the state, including East Liverpool and Beaver County. Thank you so much for all you do and every day to ensure safety. Our investigative process entailed extensive development of the facts and circumstances surrounding the accident. We conducted fact-finding with the input of our parties and conducted a public hearing. Following the hearing, we developed a transcript and added it and all statements to the public docket, which is available on our website at ntsb.gov. Thus, the fact-finding portion of our investigation was complete months ago. That aspect of the investigation culminated with an offer to our parties to make party submissions in which they could provide proposed findings to be drawn from the facts that we developed, otherwise called the evidence produced during the course of the investigation, a proposed probable cause, and or proposed safety recommendations designed to prevent future accidents. We have utilized the intervening time to conduct analysis, independent analysis of the evidence, a part of our independent investigation that is within the sole purview of the NTSB. Now, each board member has studied the draft report and met individually with the investigative team, but this is the first time that the board has gathered together to discuss the report. In a moment, the investigative team will walk us through the event, present the pertinent facts and analysis and findings, and summarize the findings in detail. After their presentations, board members will question staff on the key safety issues uncovered during the investigation. Staff will then propose the relevant findings, probable cause, and safety recommendations for board consideration. Following the incorporation of any amendments voted on today, the final report will be available on our website in a few weeks. This allows time for staff to make final edits. However, an abstract will be available today. There are 2 public dockets for the investigation. One was released prior to the hearing in June 2023 and includes the complete hearing transcripts. The second docket was released on January 25, 2024 this year. Again, they're available at ntsb.gov. Before we hear from the investigative team, I'd like to invite Member Graham, who again was the board member on scene during this investigation, to make a statement. Member Graham, you're recognized for as much time as you may consume.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Chair Hamady, board members Chapman, Brown, and Inman, investigative staff, and those joining us in person and live online. As we convene today to conclude our investigation into the train derailment in East Palestine, I want to begin by acknowledging the profound impact this incident has had on the community. To the people of East Palestine and the surrounding communities, we extend our deepest sympathies. We recognize the fear, disruption, and hardship you have endured. This board is committed to ensuring that your voices are heard and that your experiences help guide our pursuit of safety improvements on our nation's railways. I arrived with the NTSB investigative team on Saturday, February 4th. On Sunday, our command post was moved to the Unity Fire Station. When the team arrived, we were greeted by a volunteer firefighter who couldn't have been more than 18 to 19 years old. We started talking and quickly learned this young man was among the many firefighters who responded in minutes following the derailment. He told us about his experiences that night, receiving the call, quickly responding with his friends and fellow volunteer firefighters to protect their community, and the dangers they faced on the scene. Later, the firefighter's mother surprised us by bringing the NTSB investigative team a crock pot full of homemade sloppy joes, chips, and water for lunch. I'll never forget that. To me, the story of that mother and the son symbolizes the spirit, the resilience, and the character of East Palestine and the surrounding communities. In the wake of the immense tragedy, the community came together. Your strength and unity in the face of adversity has deeply moved us. Today, we present our findings mindful of the challenges faced by those affected. We are here to ensure that the lessons learned from this derailment will lead to meaningful change so no other community has to relive the challenges faced by the people of East Palestine. I also want to extend my deepest gratitude to our investigative team. Your dedication and meticulous work have been exemplary. Your efforts not only help us understand what went wrong, but pave the way for vital safety recommendations that, if implemented, will prevent similar accidents in the future and enhance the safety of our nation's railways. To the community of East Palestine, please know that your safety and well-being are at the forefront of our mission. Our work will not end with the issuance of the safety recommendations today, but rather we will continue to pursue and advocate for these safety recommendations until each one is implemented. Thank you, Chair, for this opportunity to make an opening statement, and I look forward to the meeting today.
Thank you so much. Well said. Excellent statement. Before turning it over to the investigative team, we held a community meeting last night to discuss our investigative process. I see many are back today. Thank you so much for coming in and meeting with us last night. I invite everyone back tonight for another community meeting at 6 right here in this room to answer questions you may have regarding the proceedings today, regarding all our evidence, regarding findings. We can get into as much detail as you want, and we will be here in this room for as long as it takes to answer all your questions and make sure you're heard. I'll now ask Deputy Managing Director for Investigations, Brian Curtis, to introduce members of the NTSB team participating in today's meeting. Good morning, Mr. Curtis.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair Homendy. A few announcements before we begin. I kindly request the folks here in the auditorium, if you have not already done so, please silence your mobile phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, the NTSB will call 911. We also have medics on site who are trained to provide CPR and use an AED. The NTSB will radio the medics for assistance if needed. Should we need to evacuate, there are 3 points for exit, one on either side of the stage and at the back of the auditorium where you entered. In the event of an emergency, please walk quickly to the nearest exit, don't run, and make your way outside. Once you have exited the building, please follow the sidewalk to the parking lot across the street from the school. Please follow the instructions of local police. Do not delay and do not return to the auditorium until instructed to do so. I will now introduce staff for today's meeting. In the first row, to my right, Michael Hiller, Deputy Director, Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials Investigations. Ruben Payan, Investigator in Charge. Paul Stansel, Hazardous Materials. Troy Lloyd, Initial Emergency Response and Track. Joey Ryan, Mechanical. Greg Scott, Signals, Train Control, and Wayside Defect Detectors. And Dr. Stephen Jenner, Human Factors. And behind me in the second row, left to right, Jen Adler, Director for the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Tom McMurray, General Counsel for the NTSB. Michael Badinsky, Deputy Director for the Office of Research and Engineering. Carol Waldrop, Safety Recommendations. Andrew Dykestill, Technical Writer-Editor. Adrian Lamb, Materials Laboratory. Michael Portman, Vehicle Recorder Laboratory. And Zach Zagata, Operations. The presentations will begin with an investigation overview by the investigator in charge, Ruben Payan. Mr. Payan.
Good morning, Chair Homendy and members of the board. This morning I will start with an overview of the accident investigation, followed by presentations from the group chairs in their specific investigative areas. On February 3rd, 2023, about 8:54 p.m., eastbound Norfolk Southern Freight Train 32N derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. The train consisted of 3 locomotives and 149 mixed freight rail cars, which included 20 placarded hazardous material tank cars. 17 of those tank cars were loaded and 3 were residue tank cars. The derailment involved 38 freight rail cars. Among the 30 derailed cars were 11 tank cars carrying flammable and combustible hazardous materials. 5 of these were DOT 105 specification tank cars and were carrying vinyl chloride monomer. The accident also involved 12 additional rail cars that did not derail but were damaged by the post-derailment fires. Emergency responders established a 1-mile evacuation zone that affected about 2,000 residents. Train 32N originated at the Terminal Railroad Association of St. Louis Yard in Madison, Illinois on February 1st, 2023. The train departed eastbound with a Norfolk Southern train crew and was destined for Conway Yard in Pennsylvania. On February 2nd, the train arrived in the Norfolk Southern Yard in Decatur, Illinois, where 55 rail cars were removed from the consist and an additional 40 rail cars were added to the rear of the train. One of the locomotives at the head of the train was also repositioned towards the middle of the train. Upon departure from Decatur later that same day, the train consists of 3 locomotives and 149 rail cars remained unchanged throughout the train's subsequent movements. The train arrived in Toledo, Ohio on February 3rd, where the accident crew, an engineer, a conductor, and a conductor trainee went on duty. The accident crew conducted a briefing with the previous train crew and tested the train's brakes before departing. The train departed Toledo, Ohio, beginning the last leg of its trip before the derailment. After the accident, investigators obtained surveillance footage from private homes and local businesses that captured train's 32N's movements covering a distance of more than 50 miles. In Salem, Ohio, about 26 miles from the point of derailment, surveillance footage recorded the train with the glow of a fire visible underneath the 23rd hopper car. As the train continued into Columbiana, Ohio, surveillance footage recorded the hopper car with a fire underneath the lead axle. This was about 10 miles from the point of derailment. About 4 miles from the point of derailment, surveillance footage recorded the train in New Waterford, Ohio, with fire and sparks underneath the same hopper car. Finally, in East Palestine, surveillance footage recorded the train showing a visible fire underneath the hopper car. As train 32N approached the point of derailment, the train encountered 3 wayside hot bearing defect detectors. Train 32N fully traversed the 2 defect detector locations at Sebring and Salem and began to traverse the East Palestine defect detector location when a critical alarm was received over the lead locomotive radio. The critical alarm reported axle 101 on the south rail, which corresponded to the left side bearing on the first axle of the 23rd rail car, the GPLX 75465 hopper car. Locomotive event recorder data indicated the train was traveling about 43 miles per hour at that time. After receiving the critical alarm, the train crew began to stop the train. According to the locomotive event recorder data, the engineer began to slow the train using dynamic braking before 8:54 p.m. Shortly afterward, as the train was still passing over the East Palestine hot bearing detector location, the train experienced a train line initiated emergency braking application. The head locomotives traveled about 1,670 feet before coming to a stop 38 seconds later. The crew radioed the Norfolk Southern Dispatch Center that it had experienced an emergency. The Norfolk Southern dispatcher confirmed the emergency at 8:56 p.m. and began coordinating train movements in the area to prevent other trains from colliding with train 32N. The NTSB investigation established that the following factors did not contribute to the accident. The track's condition and geometry near the derailment site did not show any defects that could have caused or contributed to derailment. The traffic control signal system and the positive train control system were functioning as designed at the time of the derailment. The crew of train 32N acted in accordance with Norfolk Southern operating rules, responding appropriately to both the bearing alarm and the derailment itself. The vinyl chloride monomer was loaded in a manner sufficient to stabilize the vinyl chloride monomer for transport and was shipped under the correct proper shipping name, UN 1086 vinyl chloride stabilized. The derailed hazardous material tank cars were not overloaded by weight or volume, and none of the 6 derailed DOT 105 tank cars sustained mechanical breaches during the derailment, including the 5 carrying vinyl chloride monomer, and none released lading except through the pressure relief device activity or the vent and burn operation. The investigation identified several safety issues in this accident. wheel bearing failures and detection, initial emergency response, hazardous material and tank car derailment performance, and the vent and burn operation. This is a list of the NTSB investigative staff that worked on the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment investigation. Additional NTSB investigative staff that also contributed to the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment are listed here. Parties to the NTSB investigation included the Federal Railroad Administration, the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the Ohio State Highway Patrol, the Village of East Palestine, the Norfolk Southern Corporation, Trinity Industries Leasing Company, International Association of Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers. Parties to the investigation also included the International Association of Firefighters, Oxyvinyls LP, GATX Corporation, Midland Manufacturing, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, and the Transportation Communications Union, or Brotherhood of Railroad Carmen. In this accident, investigators were able to use head-in and inward-facing image recorder data that detailed the crew's activities and actions in the moments leading up to and during the derailment. Norfolk Southern, like most Class I railroads, have voluntarily installed these devices, but image and audio recorders are not required by FRA regulations for freight locomotives. For this investigation, Norfolk Southern only provided 20 minutes of data. The audio and video data that was provided demonstrated and confirmed that the train crew were alert and responded appropriately to the hot bearing alarm. Additionally, the data were instrumental in corroborating train crew statements. Previously issued recommendations regarding locomotive audio and image recorders were prompted by railroad accident investigations in which NTSB determined having inward and outward facing audio and image recorders would have provided crucial information that could have improved safety. Therefore, staff has proposed reiterating one recommendation to the Secretary of Transportation, 2 recommendations to the FRA, and 1 recommendation to the Class I railroads to install crash and fire protected inward and outward facing audio and image recorders with a minimum 12-hour continuous recording capability. This concludes my opening presentation. Next, Mr. Ryan and Mr. Scott will be presenting on wheel bearing failures and detection, followed by Mr. Lloyd, who will discuss the initial emergency response, and then Mr. Stansel will present on hazardous materials and tank car derailment performance issues and the vent and burn issues. Mr. Ryan.
Good morning. This presentation will cover the bearing failure and wayside detection systems. This is a cross-section depiction of a typical railroad freight car wheel and bearing. As you can see, typical components in this bearing include rollers, cages to align the rollers, and oil seal to retain the grease and protect it from environmental conditions. This bearing is pressed onto the end of the axle known as the journal. The weight of the car is supported by 8 bearings, 4 on each side of the car. Upon arrival, investigators found the number 1 axle with the left number 1 journal burnt off from the hopper car GPLX 75465 that was carrying plastic pellets. This car was the 23rd car from the front of the train of a total of 149 car consist. A healthy or undamaged journal is cylindrical in shape. High temperatures and a defective bearing typically twist the journal into a conical shape and then falls off, allowing the car to drop to the ground and in this case to derail. A teardown of the opposing bearing on the same axle was inconclusive, meaning no defective conditions were found that would indicate a possible bearing failure. The bearing had set in the fire and perishable evidence was destroyed, including the grease seals, the outer cage, and the grease. In Madison, Illinois, the train was mechanically inspected by qualified mechanical inspectors, also known as carmen, as required by federal regulations. In Decatur, Illinois, the added 40 cars were also inspected by qualified mechanical inspectors as required. The train then proceeded to East Palestine, Ohio, where the incident took place. Post-accident inspections revealed that about 25% of the cars had federal defective conditions. The train was headed in an easterly direction with the number one axle leading. I am providing this slide as a visual indicator of the location of the left number one wheel and a photograph of the actual hopper car involved and a graphic below. The NTSB investigated two other incidents that occurred on Norfolk Southern Railway after the East Palestine derailment that also had burnt off journals. One in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, where a train traversed a hot bearing detector with a hot bearing, but the alert was not sent due to being miswired from earlier maintenance, and a journal burnt off and the train ultimately derailed. And in Elliston, Virginia, where a train crew received a hot bearing alarm after traversing a hot bearing detector, stopped and verified that the bearing was overheated, and proceeded forward, bypassing the first set-out location at track speed, where the bearing continued to overheat and ultimately burned off the journal and derailed. The mentioned cars with defective bearings from East Palestine, Newcastle, and Elliston had three similar findings. They were all axle position number one. They were all bulk hopper service type cars, and all three also had reconditioned bearings. Currently, there is no national database to research historical trends. What we found was there are no standards pertaining to operational responses to bearing alerts and alarms. A bearing database capturing bearing failure and replacement information could help identify bearing failure risk factors. We are proposing one recommendation to the Federal Railroad Administration to establish rules governing railroads' operational responses to bearing failure warnings. We are proposing one recommendation to the Association of American Railroads to develop a database of bearing failures and replacements to help determine failure risk factors. Now, Greg Scott will cover wayside detection systems.
Thank you, Joey. Above is a basic view of a typical hot bearing detector location to show the different parts. On the top right, you have a signal bungalow where the internal electronic equipment is housed and all the external equipment is connected. The signal bungalow also contains an external temperature sensor that helps determine the external ambient temperature. On the bottom right, you have two transducers that are both mounted on the same rail. These are magnetic sensors used for counting axles and determining the direction of the train. These were the items in the Newcastle derailment that Mr. Ryan spoke of earlier that were wired incorrectly. On your top left, you will see a dragging equipment detector. These paddles are on a pivotable axle and are designed to sense anything that may be dragging from the train. Bottom left is an item of focus in this investigation. These are wheel bearing scanners that are located on both rails and designed to monitor bearing temperatures. The map you see is the last three hot bearing detectors the accident train 32N traversed. It passed the Sebring detector with no alerts or alarms. It then traveled approximately 10 miles and crossed the Salem hot bearing detector and sent an alert to the back office personnel due to the bearing being 103 degrees above ambient. The 32N then traveled approximately 20 miles to the East Palestine detector that alarmed on the 101st axle L1 bearing at 253 degrees above Fahrenheit, which is the maximum temperature that this equipment is able to detect. The train crew began to take appropriate action by slowing the train when it derailed before the train could come to a complete stop. After the East Palestine accident, the Association of American Railroads stated on March 8, 2023, in a key safety measures memo that all Class 1s had committed to an average spacing of 15 miles. As you can see here in this map, the detector spacing involved in this derailment already met the newly recommended average of 15-mile spacing. Pictured on the left is the 32N passing a surveillance camera with fire visible prior to reaching the Salem hot bearing detector. When the 32N passed through the Salem detector in this location, it only showed 103 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient air temperature, which was recorded at 11 degrees. We know fire burns hotter than 103 degrees above ambient, so in theory, the hot bearing detector should have shown a critical alarm. Instead, the detector sent a non-critical alert to the back office analyst. We believe the fire that was visible was the grease that had began to burn on the outside portion of the bearing and was not detected as a hotter temperature due to the scanner aimed at the inner portion of the bearing as shown in the figure on the right. During critical alarms, when a train is occupying a detector and the defect has been detected, an automatic radio transmission is sent to the train crew. A typical message will begin with an announcement of a critical alarm and repeat 3 times. It will then follow with a detector milepost location, followed by the words hot box, meaning excessively hot journal. The message will then indicate the exact axle of the alarm location and on which rail. A typical critical alarm message will sound like the following recording. After the train receives this message, it must immediately stop for an inspection consistent with safe train handling procedures. The Federal Railroad Administration has no regulations regarding critical alarms. The Association of American Railroads does have recommendations for an overheated bearing, which states a bearing is deemed overheated when it reaches 170 degrees Fahrenheit when identified by a hot bearing detector. Prior to the accident on February 3rd, Class 1 railroads temperatures for critical alarms ranged from 136 degrees Fahrenheit to 190 degrees Fahrenheit. After the accident on February 3rd, the Class 1 railroads temperatures ranged from 136 degrees Fahrenheit to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. To these limits, the Association of American Railroads have established as an overheated bearing reflect a safe operating temperature. We believe these temperature thresholds need to be researched and identify a proper, safe operating temperature. Alerts and alarms, such as the one from the Salem hot bearing detector, are sent to a back office analyst called an advanced train control analyst. The analyst monitors all alerts and alarms and follows standard operating procedures on when to take action. This analyst also communicates with train crews to help them determine the exact location on their train of any alert or alarm. Pictured above is a screen an analyst would see displayed. It is color-coded to help him quickly distinguish the severity of alerts and alarms, with red being the most severe. When the analyst chooses a particular hot bearing alert, this is the screen he may see displayed. This screen is of the alert the analyst saw of the non-critical alert from the Salem hot bearing detector. The top portion is comparing the bearing in question to the bearings in the train itself, the 32N. The bottom portion is the trending of that bearing from the other detectors the train has passed previously. Shown is axle 101, bearing L1 with a temperature of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Per Norfolk Southern operating procedures, the analyst would simply monitor the first non-critical alert. Action is not required until 3 consecutive alerts are received that are above their threshold standards. Then the train is to be inspected when safe to do so, and delay can be minimized. Analysts would contact the crew via radio and instruct the crew of the situation and advise them to contact the dispatcher for a location to perform the inspections. Currently, the FRA has no regulations regarding temperature trending and alert limits. The Association of American Railroads does have recommendations for temperature trending and when a bearing is deemed overheated. Most Class 1s each have different protocols regarding temperature trending. Once again, do these limits need to be set at the Association of American Railroads definition of an overheated bearing or at a safe operating temperature? What we found in this investigation was first that the Salem hot bearing detector did not reflect the true temperature of the bearing. Second, that the internal bearing temperature likely exceeds external measured bearing temperatures. Third, the standard operating procedure limited the ability of the hot bearing detectors to measure a bearing's actual internal temperatures. And fourth, that the research is necessary to determine alarm and alert thresholds, distances between detectors, and review newer, more advanced technologies. And finally, that wayside bearing detectors should be subject to regulatory requirements for installation, inspection, and maintenance. We were proposing 3 recommendations to the Federal Railroad Administration. First, to research the effectiveness of current detection systems and identify minimum standards and make this research available to the public. Second, use the results from this research to establish minimum requirements for the use of the bearing defect detection systems. And third, establish requirements for installation, inspection, and maintenance of wayside bearing defect detectors. Now Troy Lloyd will cover the initial emergency response.
Thank you, Craig. Good morning, Chair and members of the board. This presentation will discuss the following: the early emergency response timeline, including initial firefighting activities, State of Ohio firefighter training standards, the availability of train consist information, and tank car placard legibility and durability. The East Palestine Police and Fire Dispatch Center received the first 911 call at 8:56 p.m., reporting that a train had derailed with explosion and fire. The dispatch center radioed the East Palestine Fire Department at 8:58 p.m., requesting all available fire and emergency medical services units to respond. The fire department and the police department arrived on scene about 9 p.m. The East Palestine Police Department were first to arrive on scene and started evacuating homes near the burning tank cars. They also established control zones entering the incident site. The deputy fire chief arrived on scene a few minutes later. After assessing the incident scene, the deputy fire chief assumed the role of incident commander and established a command post at the Lake Oil property site adjacent to the derailment pileup and burning rail cars. The early emergency response at East Palestine focused on containing the fire and protecting residents near the derailment site. The incident commander instructed the Fire Dispatch Center to use the emergency notification system to advise residents near the derailment to shelter in place. At about 11 p.m., Norfolk Southern personnel and contractors arrived on scene and started an assessment of the incident scene. They informed the incident commander of the dangers of having personnel operating near the burning rail cars. Also, about 11 p.m., residents within a 1-mile radius were ordered to evacuate the area. Developed by the United States Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the Emergency Response Guide is the go-to guide for emergency responders working at a hazardous materials incident site. The Emergency Response Guidebook helps personnel to quickly identify hazardous materials at an incident site, recognize the potential hazards associated with the hazardous materials, gather public safety guidance, and execute recommended emergency response guidance. The Emergency Response Guide supplies emergency responders with a yes-no decision tree matrix when referencing for hazardous materials. As shown, answering no to questions regarding UN numbers, material names, placards, or other missing identification indicators, The decision tree leads the emergency responder to the mixed load unidentified cargo page, or Guide 111. Without referencing the 2020 Emergency Response Guidebook, firefighters approached the pileup and began applying water to contain the fire, which grew rapidly. The correct guidance from the 2020 Emergency Response Guidebook was the mixed load unidentified cargo, or Guide 111, for a fire involving tank cars. The guide advises a 1/2 mile preliminary isolation and evacuation of the scene. While the firefighters acted in good faith to protect their community, the initial emergency response did not conform to the guidance for fires involving tank cars and unknown materials. In Ohio, volunteer firefighter training is mandated by state statute. A training course for a volunteer firefighter certificate is limited to 36 hours by statute, cannot include participation in training involving hazardous environments, and does not include training in hazardous materials response. The volunteer certification is classified as a support level training only. Fire chiefs or authorities having jurisdictions are responsible for providing additional training for volunteers that are expected to operate in hazardous environments. However, the NTSB is concerned that volunteer fire departments in the state of Ohio are called on to respond to the same incidents as their professional counterparts, as seen in this accident, but the volunteers may only have a fraction of the training Ohio and the NFPA require for professional firefighters. Firefighter 1 certification meets the minimum standard for professional firefighter professional qualifications established by the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, and recommended minimum level of certification to provide firefighting services in the state of Ohio. The course includes advanced firefighter training, hazardous materials awareness and operations level training, and training on the National Fallen Firefighters Association 16 life safety initiatives. In addition to the Firefighter 1 course, students are required to complete an emergency vehicle operations course and training on the National Incident Management System. Firefighter 2 is the highest level of firefighter certification available in Ohio. The Firefighter 2 certification is typically required for career firefighters in the state of Ohio. The certification meets the minimum requirements set forth in the Standard for Firefighter Professional Qualifications established by the NFPA as a qualifying level of public safety responder for trained firefighters. To be eligible for the Firefighter 2 certification, students shall successfully complete a combined 240-hour Firefighter 1 and Firefighter 2 course through an Ohio chartered training program, including training in emergency medical services. What we found was that the state of Ohio training requirements for volunteer firefighters did not meet the minimum NFPA Firefighter 1 standards. The Firefighter 1 standards include training in hazardous environments and training in hazardous materials response to the operations level. Therefore, staff proposes two recommendations. One, to the state of Ohio to amend its firefighter training statute and revise its volunteer firefighter certification standards to meet the National Fire Protection Association 1010 standard for professional firefighter qualifications. And one recommendation to the National Volunteer Fire Council, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and the International Association of Firefighters to advise its members of the circumstances of the East Palestine train derailment and fire, identify volunteer fire departments whose personnel are not trained to the NFPA 1010 standard for professional firefighter qualifications, and recommend departments to adopt training that meets the standard, and inform them of funding opportunities through private, state, and federal programs. About 9 p.m., the East Palestine Fire and Police Dispatch called the Norfolk Southern Dispatch Center in Atlanta and requested consist information for Train 32N. The individual who answered the phone said that they would call back, but we did not find evidence of a return phone call. The Columbiana County Emergency Management Agency director received the train consist from Norfolk Southern via email about 10 p.m. The director then emailed the train consist to the East Liverpool Fire Chief, who was responding as the Hazardous Materials Branch Chief. The incident commander learned through a phone conversation that the burning tank cars contained vinyl chloride monomer. After obtaining this information, all firefighters were instructed to evacuate the area, and the command post was relocated about 1 mile from the derailment site about midnight. The East Palestine Fire Chief arrived on scene about 2 a.m. on February 4th, assumed the role of incident commander, and obtained a copy of the train consist at the new command post. The delayed transmittal of the train consist increased the time emergency responders operated in the hot zone and delayed the recommended emergency response guidance evacuation distances. This resulted in greater exposure of emergency responders and to the public to post-derailment hazards. Ask Rail mobile app is a safety tool that provides first responders immediate access to accurate, timely data about what type of hazardous materials a rail car is carrying so they can make an informed decision about how to respond to a rail emergency. Ask Rail was designed to give first responders immediate information about rail cars carrying hazardous materials and be an invaluable tool for helping prepare those on the front line should a rail incident occur. Since the incident, the Columbiana County Emergency Management Agency has coordinated with NS and Ask Rail to provide training to each of the 5 county 911 centers on the use of the Ask Rail application. The NTSB has investigated other accidents involving train consist availability, including the July 10th, 2005 collision and derailment of 2 Canadian National Railway Company freight trains in Anding, Mississippi. The accident resulted in 4 train crew member fatalities, the release of 15,000 gallons of diesel fuel that burned for about 15 hours, and the evacuation of 100 residents. As a result of that accident, the NTSB recommended to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, with the assistance of the Federal Railroad Administration, require that railroads immediately provide to emergency responders accurate, real-time information regarding the identity and location of hazardous materials on a train. On July 24th of 2024, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration published a final rule titled Hazardous Materials Fast Act Requirements for Real-Time Train Consist Information. The rule requires all railroads transporting hazardous materials to maintain a separate electronic consist for hazardous material trains. The rule also requires railroads to immediately contact local emergency responders and provide them with consist information in the event of an accident involving a train carrying hazardous materials. Class 1 railroads have 1 year to comply to the rule. Class 2 and 3 railroads have 2 years. Despite the 9 p.m. request from East Palestine Fire Dispatch, Train 32N's consist information did not reach emergency responders until shortly before 10 p.m., when it was delivered as an email to one of the emergency response agencies. Not until about 11 p.m. at the recommendation of the Ohio State Patrol did the East Palestine Fire Department Deputy Fire Chief, acting as the incident commander, issue a 1-mile evacuation the distance recommended by the 2020 Emergency Response Guidebook for fire involving tank cars transporting vinyl chloride. About the same time, NS personnel and contractors began arriving on scene and recommending that firefighters redeploy to safer distances. Firefighters suspended fire suppression activities and relocated to safer positions around midnight on February 4th. Therefore, staff proposes one recommendation to Norfolk Southern Railway that it review and revise its policies to ensure that accurate train consist information is immediately available to emergency responders during an emergency. Staff also proposes the reclassification of one recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. With the assistance of the Federal Railroad Administration, require that railroads immediately provide to emergency responders accurate, real-time information regarding the identity and location of all hazardous materials on a train. Rail cars containing hazardous materials must be placarded in accordance with federal placard design requirements. These placards can assist emergency responders with identifying hazardous materials and safe response actions. As shown in the pictures, some placards were destroyed and could not be used to quickly identify the train's hazardous materials. Although placards must be capable of withstanding weather conditions, the federal design standard does not address derailments or fires. Placard requirements should include survivability sufficient to ensure that they are usable by emergency responders during rail transportation emergencies. When a shipping name or identification number cannot be associated with a tank car or other package during an emergency response, the Emergency Response Guidebook recommends reading placards from a safe distance to determine what protective measures are appropriate. Federal regulations require that placards must be capable of withstanding 30 days of exposure to open weather conditions without deterioration or a substantial reduction in effectiveness. The performance standard does not account for placard survivability during derailments or fire exposure. Therefore, staff proposes one recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to require that placards be able to survive fires and accidents and remain legible during such emergencies. This concludes my presentation. Next, Mr. Stanson will be presenting on hazardous materials.
Good morning, Chair Hamady and members of the board. My presentation will cover several additional hazardous material safety issues identified during the investigation, including those issues listed on this slide. The post-derailment fire likely began with a punctured DOT 111 tank car that released butyl acrylates, a Class 3 flammable liquid. This tank car sustained head punctures sizable enough to have rapidly released its contents, spilling the chemical along a 1,100-foot segment of track. The fire spread to other rail cars and combustible materials released from the train. DOT 111 tank cars are susceptible to breaching damage because the design does not typically include safety systems that have become standard for more robust specification tank cars, such as the DOT 117. These safety features include head shields, steel jackets, thermal protection systems, top fittings protection, and tanks fabricated from thicker normalized steel for puncture resistance. Fire exposure from burning released lading caused pressure relief devices, or PRDs, to actuate on intact DOT 105 tank cars carrying vinyl chloride. This led to Norfolk Southern and its contractors voicing concerns about vinyl chloride polymerization. The events that eventually led to the vent and burn action could have been avoided had there been no DOT 111 tank cars carrying combustible and flammable liquids on this train. In accordance with the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or FAST Act, which requires phase-out of flammable liquids tank cars not meeting minimum DOT 117 performance specifications, the damaged DOT 111 tank car that released butyl acrylates in this derailment would no longer have been authorized for transportation and flammable liquids service after May 1st, 2029. The East Palestine derailment has prompted calls for accelerating the pace of the DOT 111 phase-out mandate. While industry acknowledges the capacity to accomplish an accelerated phase-out, a recent Federal Railroad Administration report found that economic disincentives could make this unlikely under voluntary action. In addition, the Secretary of Transportation does not have discretion to change the compliance dates. Staff has therefore proposed a safety recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to seek legislative authority for an accelerated phase-out of DOT 111 tank cars in flammable liquids service. The FAST Act does not require non-pressure tank cars used to transport combustible and other flammable materials to meet DOT 117 specifications. Of the 3 DOT 111 tank cars that were breached in this accident, 2 of them were carrying combustible liquids, which were not subject to the FAST Act's phase-out. Based on their long history of poor derailment crashworthiness and an unacceptable safety record, the presence of DOT 111 tank cars in a mixed freight train increases the probability of lading releases from other, more robust tank cars. Therefore, staff has proposed a safety recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to establish a replacement program for tank cars not meeting DOT 117 tank car safety standards. During the emergency response to this derailment, Norfolk Southern and its contractors cited polymerized vinyl chloride monomer, or VCM, affecting the proper function of the tank car pressure relief devices as their reason for advocating vent and burn actions. This prompted NTSB investigators to conduct post-derailment examinations of the tank car service equipment. The examinations found evidence of lading incompatibility with certain components, including some pressure relief devices that were corroded and seized. These components did not withstand the effect of corrosive gases produced by vinyl chloride. Aluminum-coated pressure relief device valve springs that had been significantly deteriorated. The vinyl chloride manufacturer's safety data sheet states that the material is incompatible with aluminum and reactions with this substance can be strongly exothermic. The protective housing covers of 3 vinyl chloride tank cars made from aluminum melted and allowed the aluminum to re-solidify onto pressure relief device components. Aluminum has a much lower melting point compared with steel and is susceptible to thermal damage. These photographs show the accumulation of aluminum in the pressure relief device structures, which must remain free of debris to ensure adequate venting capacity. The thermally destroyed and missing protective housing covers shown in this photograph led to metallic debris accumulating in the pressure relief device. Aluminum valve hand wheels were also destroyed, hampering any attempt to unload the tank cars through normal means. Although the use of aluminum components rendered the tank cars susceptible to thermal damage, there was insufficient evidence in this incident to determine whether this contributed to the release of hazardous materials. To ensure that tank car safety equipment components meet safety requirements, the manufacturer provides designs to the Association of American Railroads, or AAR, for approval. Although federal regulations require the pressure relief devices to be made of materials compatible with the lading such that they have sufficient flow capacity to prevent tank overpressure during a fire, the AAR does not conduct independent testing, reference relevant scientific literature, or require demonstrations of manufacturers' representations. Therefore, the approval process lacks a means of verifying the equipment will perform in service as required. Because this incomplete review process may create safety hazards that could be avoided by more careful reviews, staff has proposed a safety recommendation to the Association of American Railroads for establishing criteria to demonstrate tank car service equipment lading compatibility. Additionally, staff proposes one safety recommendation to the Federal Railroad Administration for oversight of the recommended AAR action and to use its regulatory authority to address weaknesses in the service equipment approval process. Federal regulations prescribe operational requirements for high-hazard flammable trains, or HHFTs, that are designed to mitigate derailments in trains carrying large quantities of flammable liquids. Safety benefits of the regulation are derived from special routing, incident planning, speed restrictions, braking, and requirements for the use of more survivable tank cars. These requirements currently pertain to trains containing 20 or more loaded Class 3 flammable liquids tank cars in a single block, or 35 such tank cars distributed throughout a train. Train 32N was not defined as a high-hazard flammable train because it contained only 2 applicable flammable liquids tank cars. The post-derailment fires in East Palestine were similar to scenarios the high-hazard flammable train rules were intended to prevent, and also demonstrate that mixed freight trains carrying flammable gases and combustible liquids are also vulnerable to cascading fires and hazardous materials releases. Thus, the probability of a fire-induced cascading hazardous materials release depends in part on variations in tank car survivability and on the presence of additional flammabilities other than Class 3 flammable liquids. Staff proposes a safety recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration for revising the high-hazard flammable train regulatory definition to include additional hazardous materials and subject these requirements to fewer numbers of applicable tank cars in a train. The Association of American Railroads defines key train in Circular OT 55, which establishes recommended operating practices for the transportation of hazardous materials. Key train definitions include 20 carloads or intermodal portable tank loads of any combination of hazardous material and fewer numbers of rail cars when certain commodities such as poisonous or radioactive materials are present in a train. Key trains are restricted to a 50-mile-per-hour maximum speed. If a key train wheel bearing defect is reported by a wayside detector, but a visual inspection fails to confirm the defect, the train must not exceed 30 miles per hour until it is passed over the next detector or delivered to a terminal for mechanical inspection. Cars with confirmed defects must be set out from the train. Because the train only contained 17 loaded hazardous materials cars, Train 32N contained too few hazardous materials cars to classify it as a key train under current definitions. The protective requirements for key trains provided in Circular OT 55 should account for the elevated risk posed by the presence of DOT 111 tank cars carrying hazardous materials. Staff therefore proposes a recommendation to the Association of American Railroads to designate as key trains any train transporting hazardous materials and tank cars that do not meet or exceed DOT 117 safety standards. On February 4th, about 5:30 p.m., Norfolk Southern and its contractors observed an unusually energetic release of burning vapor from the pressure relief device of one of the vinyl chloride tank cars. Norfolk Southern contractors, SPSI and SRS, interpreted the incident as a sign that vinyl chloride had polymerized and obstructed the tank car pressure relief device. This energetic pressure relief device actuation of a 70-minute duration, followed by cessation of activity, marked their first consideration for the need to conduct vent and burn actions. During his post-incident interview, the SPSI president remarked, "We are already there at a vent and burn in our minds." Federal regulations require hazardous materials shippers to provide comprehensive emergency response information for materials they offer into transportation. Beginning on the morning of February 4th, Norfolk Southern and its contractors communicated with OxyVinyls, the vinyl chloride manufacturer and shipper. On February 5th, OxyVinyls deployed 3 experts to the derailment scene. In its communications with Norfolk Southern and its contractors, OxyVinyls assessed a low probability of dangerous polymerization given the condition of the intact tank cars, and they recommended monitoring shipper. On February 5th, OxyVinyls deployed 3 experts to the derailment scene. In its communications with Norfolk Southern and its contractors, OxyVinyls assessed a low probability of dangerous polymerization given the condition of the intact tank cars, and they recommended monitoring the tank car temperatures for evidence of exothermic polymerization reactions. OxyVinyls further explained that the vapor pressure within the tank cars, the vinyl chloride tank cars, would only reach the level necessary to actuate pressure relief devices when the lading temperature reached 185 degrees Fahrenheit. OxyVinyls also advised Norfolk Southern that because the tank cars were not breached and were therefore under positive pressure, oxygen could not have entered the tanks to destabilize the vinyl chloride and promote polymerization. Contrary to OxyVinyls' technical advice, Norfolk Southern and its contractors interpreted tank car temperatures as signs of dangerous polymerization. While the temperature of 4 tank cars remained stable, the downward trend in tank shell temperature on a 5th tank car should have prompted a pause in proceeding with the vent and burn action based on their understanding the chemical reactivity was related to the tank car temperature. Instead of the cooling temperature trend shown on this slide, a runaway polymerization reaction would have produced a rapid and sustained exponential temperature increase. The observed temperature trend in tank car OCPX 80370 shown on this chart is not indicative of a polymerization reaction. Curiously, Norfolk Southern's manager of hazardous materials told NTSB investigators that according to OxyVinyls, if the tank car shell temperature had risen to a critical temperature of 185 degrees Fahrenheit, a runaway polymerization reaction would have ensued. This is incorrect because, as OxyVinyls explained, 185 degrees Fahrenheit is the temperature at which the vapor pressure would have been sufficient to actuate pressure relief devices. This erroneous runaway polymerization statement suggests a misunderstanding or confusion between Oxyvinyl's technical support team and Norfolk Southern's expert contractors. As the intensity of the fires reduced, Norfolk Southern contractors interpreted the cessation of pressure relief device actuations as evidence they had become blocked with the formation of polymer. However, this was most likely because tank car temperatures were too low to produce sufficient vapor pressure to actuate them, or the lading had become depleted by their earlier pressure relief venting. Despite this contradictory evidence, Norfolk Southern and its contractors continued to assert the necessity of a vent and burn, even though available evidence should have led them to reevaluate their initial conclusions. Tank car loading records confirmed the vinyl chloride had been stabilized by oxygen removal. The tank cars remained under positive pressure until the vent and burn, preventing the infiltration of oxygen and other contaminants that could have promoted polymerization reactions. Examination of the internal PRD, or pressure relief device components, recovered from the tank cars found no evidence of polymer obstructions that would have affected their function. This lack of solidified matter within the service equipment cavities does not indicate a polymerization reaction occurred within the tank cars. Available scientific information and evidence suggests the vinyl chloride did not undergo polymerization, and the vent and burn action therefore would not have been necessary to prevent a polymerization-induced tank car rupture. Nevertheless, a PHMSA hazardous materials incident report database query found that Norfolk Southern reported polymerization as the cause of the package failures for the 5 vinyl chloride tank cars. Staff proposes one recommendation to Norfolk Southern Railway to revise its incident report to accurately reflect the package failure cause. Oxyvinyls had no direct interaction with the East Palestine Fire Chief Incident Commander or with elements of the Incident Command other than Norfolk Southern and its contractors, SPSI and SRS. Their technical information and conclusions about the lack of dangerous vinyl chloride polymerization were not relayed to the Incident Commander, and the Incident Commander was not aware that Oxyvinyls was available as a source of expertise. The Incident Commander approved the vent and burn action based on information provided by Norfolk Southern, SPSI, and SRS in 2 meetings with the Incident Command staff. However, Norfolk Southern and its contractors, who were in control of the derailment scene assessment, compromised the integrity of the vent and burn decision by withholding complete and accurate expert opinions and information from the Incident Commander. Further, the Incident Commander could have made a better informed decision about the vent and burn action had Oxyvinyls been a participant in the Incident Command meetings. Vent and burn is a seldom used procedure using explosives to breach tank car shells to safely reduce the internal vapor pressure to decrease the potential for sudden tank failure. This procedure also empties the contents of the tank to facilitate disposal of the chemical by burning. The vent and burn method should only be used when there is a high probability of catastrophic tank shell failure. Several mitigation options were considered and rejected in favor of the vent and burn. An alternative option to allow the tank cars to finish cooling while then taking time to complete detailed damage assessments was overlooked. The pattern of dismissing contradictory evidence while interpreting ambiguous evidence in support of Norfolk Southern's and its contractors' original belief was consistent with confirmation bias, a tendency to gather evidence that confirms pre-existing expectations while dismissing or failing to seek contradictory evidence. Whatever the underlying explanations were for the continued support of a vent and burn action, none justifies failing to communicate accurate and complete information, including dissenting expert opinions, to the incident command. Staff has proposed a safety recommendation to Norfolk Southern to address accurate communications with incident commanders. Sources of vinyl chloride hazard information that Norfolk Southern and its contractors referenced while forming initial judgments about the potential for catastrophic tank rupture included the Chlorine Institute Pamphlet 171. This pamphlet provides guidance for safe handling and emergency response for vinyl chloride transported in rail cars and contains information related to polymerization hazards. Among the communications regarding vinyl chloride hazards, the pamphlet states that at a pressure above 68 psi-G or a tank surface temperature above ambient may be indicative of polymerization. These statements do not take into consideration other explanations of elevated temperatures and pressures and can lead the reader to incorrectly conclude that polymerization is occurring. Expert testimony at the NTSB investigative hearing, scientific and historical evidence indicate that thermal initiation of dangerous vinyl chloride polymerization in the absence of an initiator compound is unlikely in a tank car transportation scenario. Thus, Pamphlet 171 overstates the probability of polymerization in these circumstances, which can lead to erroneous mitigation actions. Staff proposes a safety recommendation to the Chlorine Institute to revise safety messages contained in Pamphlet 171 regarding the risk of polymerization in a rail accident. The Chlorine Institute's ChlorEP Contractor Program provides for the availability of expert incident mitigation contractors who meet qualifications for addressing incidents involving certain chlor-alkali industry products, such as vinyl chloride monomer. The Chlorine Institute audits ChlorEP contractors every 3 years to verify they possess necessary capabilities. Norfolk Southern Railway employed 2 of the only 3 available Level 3 ChlorEP contractors for its response to East Palestine. Level 3 contractors are supposed to be the most highly qualified, possessing the capability to conduct field transfers and take advanced mitigating actions on severely damaged tank cars. Vent and burn action is not among the specific capabilities addressed by these qualifications. Norfolk Southern contractors did not correctly interpret evidence relevant to vinyl chloride polymerization, nor did they recognize the limitations of written hazard communications or make use of expert opinions contrary to their assumptions. Level 3 ChlorEP contractors should possess advanced technical knowledge to accurately assess chemical hazards for the commodities covered under this program, while providing accurate hazard information to incident commanders. Thus, staff has proposed a safety recommendation to address ChlorEP contractor training and verification of capabilities. Tank car temperature information recorded on scene by emergency response contractors, the timing of pressure relief device actuations, and indicators of hazardous polymerization are all relevant to the accuracy of emergency response guidance. This information collected during the response to this incident is a vital resource in ensuring that hazardous materials guidance is supportive of emergency response actions. Thus, staff has proposed a safety recommendation to Norfolk Southern Railway to address policies for contractors to keep detailed records and share information used to make emergency response decisions. In 1994 and in 2007, the Federal Railroad Administration published reports about the vent and burn method for tank cars, in which it recognizes it is a valid but high-risk procedure to be used only as a last resort for certain flammable, liquefied, compressed gases. These reports contain guidance for how an incident command should approach such a decision. However, the guidance could be improved with more comprehensive information regarding what products are appropriate for vent and burn action, what hazards may result, and an intuitive decision tree to aid first responders who may consider employing the method. At the time of the East Palestine incident, the incident commander was not aware of the report's existence and would not have had access to it because it had been marked sensitive security information. Recently, the Federal Railroad Administration lifted the security restrictions for these reports and published them on its website. Although a vent and burn action was not necessary in East Palestine to prevent a polymerization-induced catastrophic tank rupture, such action could be appropriate under different circumstances. Therefore, the significant impact of a vent and burn action to a community demonstrates the need for widely available federal guidance on what circumstances and what products are warranted for the procedure. Staff has proposed 3 recommendations to the Federal Railroad Administration to address the need for updated and more comprehensive vent and burn guidance and for increasing its availability to emergency response agencies. 1 recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration for distribution of the guidance, and 1 recommendation to the International Association of Fire Chiefs, International Association of Firefighters, and the National Volunteer Fire Council to inform their membership of the circumstances surrounding the vent and burn and the availability of the federal guidance. Chair Hamady, this concludes staff's presentations.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your excellent presentations. We're going to take a break till 11:05. It's about 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and go to the question rounds. For the community's preparation and those watching, we'll have 30-minute break for lunch from about 12:30 to 1. That's approximate depending on how we're going, and we'll do another 15-minute break around 3 o'clock. But we will be back at 11:05 and start promptly at that point. Thank you. Again, I want to thank the staff for their excellent presentations. We are going to turn to board member questions focused on 4 key safety issues identified in this investigation. First, wheel bearings failures and detection. Second, initial emergency response. Third, hazardous materials and tank car derailment performance. Fourth, vent and burn. Members have had the draft report since May 17th and have had discussions with staff and have asked questions. The purpose of this discussion and focused deliberation is to highlight those areas where we believe we can make the biggest difference to improve safety. Members are reminded to limit their questions to the specific safety issue at hand. We found that it helps the public better follow the discussion. We're going to limit questions to 2 rounds. By my calculation, that gives us about an hour per section, plus about 30 minutes for a catch-all round for anything that is not in these 4 areas. And we'll see if there is time left over under one section, we'll carry it over to the next section. And again, we'll have a catch-all round at the end. We're going to begin our discussion on wheel bearings failures and detection. Member Graham is recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start with just kind of the beginning, if we could. Like when I was here, came up here with the investigative team, we know the derailment occurred at milepost 49.5. Can you please discuss how the investigative team determined the exact point of derailment like you did for me on that Sunday?
Yeah, so when we arrived post-derailment, there was marks on the rail that would indicate that the truck frame from the hopper car had fallen onto the rail, showing scrape marks. When the opposing wheel derailed from the opposing track, it made flange marks into the ties, indicating that that's the point of derailment.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to jump to the L1 bearing damage assessment. What impact, if any, did the reconditioning of the L1 bearing have on this derailment?
The findings on our teardown were inconclusive, meaning that generally when a bearing gets hot and burns off the journal, it gets destroyed in the process. This was a reconditioned bearing. Reconditioned bearings have about half the life of a new bearing. The opposing bearing was tore down, as it's the closest exemplar bearing that would possibly be in the same type of service as the bearing that burnt off. So that bearing was tore down, and it was also inconclusive because it was in the pool fire for a long period of time, and perishable evidence was destroyed, including the seal, the grease, and one of the internal components. The cage was also burnt and melted and missing.
So I think it's good for the public to know, is it uncommon to have a reconditioned bearing on a freight car or a tank car?
A majority of the bearings on freight cars are reconditioned bearings.
Because the life of a car goes for how long? 30, 40, 50 years sometimes?
The life of the car?
A life of a car?
Yeah, you were correct.
So it's not uncommon for an unconditioned or a reconditioned bearing on a car.
Yes.
You did talk about 2 other investigations we're doing in Newcastle and Elliston that occurred as a result of failed reconditioned bearing. Are we able to determine any commonalities or trends across the 3 derailments?
Yeah, so those 3 derailments, they were all burnt off journals due to bearing defects, and the commonalities were they were all on axle position 1, they were all reconditioned bearings, and they were all in hopper car bulk type service.
Okay.